All right, welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We're diving into some pretty fundamental concepts today, risk and control. We've got a ton of material here, and I think this is going to give everyone listening a really good framework for thinking about these two ideas and how they work together.
hmm
Because they really are all over the place in any organization, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we want to do today is, kind of cut through all the jargon, all the noise, and get down to what risk really means and why controls are so essential for dealing with all the uncertainties that organizations face all the time, right?
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is risk? One of our sources, Isaaca, defines it as a potential uncertain event that may be harmful or may negatively impact objective achievement. It boils down to two key factors. First, how likely is that event to actually happen? That's the probability. And second, if it does happen, how bad would the impact be? And when you multiply those two things together, that gives you your risk level. So high risk, that means both a high probability and a high impact.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how this seemingly simple equation, probability times impact really underpins so much of what we see in organizations, whether it's the way that internal audit approaches their work, really focusing on those high risk areas, or even just understanding why certain procedures are in place. It all comes back to this core idea of risk.
Right. And it's not just about avoiding negative stuff either. Organizations also have something called a risk appetite, which is basically how much risk they are willing to take on in pursuit of their objectives.
Hmm.
Their comfort level with uncertainty, and different organizations have different appetites,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Like, imagine a government agency, right? They're probably going to be pretty risk averse. They want stability, they need to follow all the rules. And then you have, a startup, right? They might be much more comfortable with risk, willing to embrace uncertainty because they're looking for that huge growth, that innovation, right? So different goals, different risk appetites.
Makes total sense. So we know risks are out there, but what do we do about them? How do we manage them? That's where controls come in. Controls are basically any actions that an organization takes to, try to reduce either the likelihood of a risk happening or the impact if it does happen.
Exactly. And, we can think about different examples of controls in different areas. So let's take operational risk, like fraud, right? What are some controls that we might see there? Well, internal audit is a big one. They can help detect and even prevent fraudulent activity. Or, think about background checks for new employees. That's a preventative measure to try to reduce the risk of hiring someone who, might have a history of fraud.
That makes sense. What about compliance risk? Like, the risk of breaking the law. What kind of controls would we see there?
Yeah, so in that case, having legal counsel review contracts before they're signed is a really crucial preventative control. Their expertise helps, avoid potentially illegal or harmful commitments.
Gotcha. What about human resource risk? Like, high employee turnover. That's a big risk for a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So better employee benefits,
Yeah.
things that make people want to stay, that can be a preventative control. And employee satisfaction surveys, those act as more of a detective control, right? They can kind of flag potential issues early on that might be leading to people leaving.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And then what about financial risk? Like the risk of, just running out of cash, liquidity problems.
Yeah, so good cash management practices are essential there to help kind of cushion the blow if there are some, unexpected costs or revenue shortfalls. And budgeting, that's a control that helps prevent these kinds of issues in the first place, right? By planning and managing finances proactively.
Absolutely. And then what about those big strategic risks? The ones that could impact an organization in the long term, like massive technological shifts or changes in the economy or society in general. How do we manage those?
Right. So that's where adaptive strategic planning comes in. That allows an organization to kind of prepare for different future scenarios so they can be more adaptable and minimize the negative impact of those changes. And then building organizational resilience, that's the ability to bounce back quickly from disruptions. That's another crucial control for managing strategic risk.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we've kind of touched on, different types of risk, but controls aren't all the same either, right? Our sources actually categorize them in a few different ways. Like one way is by when they act.
Exactly. So you have preventive controls, right? Those are designed to stop problems before they happen. Think about things like passwords or requiring approvals for certain transactions. Then you have detective controls, and those are used to identify problems after they've already occurred. So things like monitoring systems or, doing regular reviews. And then finally, you have corrective controls, and those are implemented to, fix problems once they've been detected. So like, updating a system or retraining employees.
Yeah, so could you give us a quick example of, all three types of controls working together, like in a specific scenario?
Sure, sure. Let's take the example of protecting sensitive information.
Right.
Right. So multi-factor authentication, that would be a preventative control. It makes it harder for unauthorized users to access the system in the first place. Then you might have an intrusion detection system, an IDS, right? That's a detective control. It's constantly monitoring for suspicious activity and will flag it if it sees something. And then if there is a data breach, right, restoring from backups and patching vulnerabilities, those would be corrective actions to fix the problem and minimize the damage.
Yeah, that's a really helpful breakdown. And then controls can also be categorized by, what they're actually controlling,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. So you have physical controls, right? Those are designed to protect physical assets, things like locks, security guards, access control systems, fire extinguishers. And then you have logical or technical controls. Those protect systems, networks, data. Think passwords, encryption, firewalls, intrusion detection systems again, access control lists, and then finally administrative controls. Those are your policies, procedures, guidelines, things like security policies, training programs, incident response plans, risk assessments, all that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And then, in the IT world specifically, there are even more specific categories based on scope.
Right. You have general IT controls, often called ITGCs. Those are broadly applicable to, all systems and applications within an organization. They ensure the overall security and reliability of the IT environment. Things like change management, backup and recovery, physical security of the data center, that sort of thing. And then application controls are more specific to individual applications. They're designed to ensure the accuracy and completeness of data at different stages. So like at the input stage, process stage, output stage. Examples would be input validation rules, making sure that data is entered correctly, or making sure calculations are performed correctly, or doing checks on the accuracy of reports.
Right. That makes sense. And then, finally we have ISO 31000, which offers some overarching principles for risk management. What are some of the key ideas there for you?
Yeah, so ISO 31000, it's really more about the big picture. It emphasizes that managing risk shouldn't be, like a one-off activity, right? It should be integrated into everything an organization does. It should be structured, it should be comprehensive, customized to the organization's specific needs. It should be inclusive, involve everyone who's relevant, and it should be dynamic, meaning it should adapt as things change. It should be based on the best available information. It should consider the human and cultural factors, and it should always be looking for ways to improve.
Wow, that's a lot to take in, but it sounds like, these principles really highlight the importance of making risk management a core part of how an organization operates.
Exactly. And, I think what's important to remember is that these ISO standards, they exist to provide a framework for organizations to follow, right? So that there's some consistency, some interoperability, some best practices that everyone can kind of adhere to.
Makes sense. So bringing it all back to, to our listeners, the big takeaway here is that risk and control they're really inseparable, right? You can't think about one effectively without the other. It's about understanding what could go wrong, how bad it could be, and then putting the right safeguards in place to minimize those threats across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you navigate your own challenges, whether it's at work, in your personal life, wherever, understanding these basic principles of risk and control can really give you a valuable framework for decision making. It can help you make better, more informed decisions.
And I think this is where things get really, really interesting. Because in a world that's constantly changing, with technology evolving at a crazy pace, new risks emerging all the time, unexpected events happening, how do you think our approaches to risk and control need to evolve to keep up, to really protect what matters? That's something I think we all need to be thinking about as we continue to explore and learn and navigate the complexities of our world. So thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.